as a shield, because I feel that I'm going to say some pretty controversial things, so I'm going to get some protection before I start.
That's reasonable.
First I want to say though a few words about Kate. Kate Mackrell is my PhD student. She's a mature student but what she has been doing recently is turning herself into a philosopher, which I'm not. And the paper that we put together is really largely her work on the detail about the philosophical arguments for the relationship between constructionism and constructivism, or as we're suggesting, something that we're calling the space of reasons. It's interesting why Kate isn't here actually. Kate lives in Canada, and she, as an example of how she gets involved in many different things, I can explain why she's not here. Kate, in Canada, it's one of the few countries in the world where you're allowed to sponsor refugees from Syria. And so she has set up 2 houses, and she has 2 families for Syrian refugees who are living in those houses, and she feels compelled to integrate in the local schools. And so because that is such a time-consuming thing for her, she can't be here. Okay, so I thought that was worth mentioning. I think it's fair to say that the philosophical arguments in this paper are primarily hers. But my presentation, my aim in this presentation, is really to try and provide some background, some gloss on the paper. Some of you may have already read the paper, some of you may be trying to decide whether to read it or not. In either case, I think it will be useful for you to have some background, to try and explain the reasons why we're actually asking some of these fundamental questions. Questions like, what is the theoretical underpinning for constructionism? I want to say from the outset that you shouldn't think because we're asking these questions we're skeptics of constructionism. On the contrary, those of you who know me will know that I've been involved in constructionism and constructionist practice for many decades. As a school teacher, I was using logo in the 1980s with my children. I developed many logo microworlds. The first one I can remember was a microworld in which you could put forces or impulses on the turtle in order for students who were struggling, as most students do, to understand Newton's laws of motion. It was a practical way for them to gain some sense of that model. So I've done much work with logo in the past. So in a way I'm laying down my credentials in saying it. But another question is, what does Piaget teach us about teaching mathematics? And I think at 29, which is now a long time ago, I was a pretty inexperienced teacher in a secondary school. And I was following an MA, a Master of Education course. And I had a tutor who had been herself a student of Piaget's. And she was making us read the original works, which those of you who have done it will know is very difficult to read, it's very formally written, something akin really to formal logic, if you like, or advanced mathematics, university level mathematics, is the style of writing, I feel, Piaget's original work. So, as I was rather well, would have gone about teaching mathematics. And her answer really surprised me. Her answer was that she thought he would take the children into the kitchen, into the school's kitchen, and he would have them cooking. And this wouldn't be a one-off lesson, they would be absorbed in that situation. So they would be cooking to learn mathematics as an ongoing process. And I thought to myself, this isn't the Piaget I'm reading in this formal writing, this is a completely different Piaget that she knew about, but somehow didn't come across in his writing. And I was sort of bugged by this difference between the 2 Piagets. I could sort of imagine now that I know a bit more about constructionism, I could now retro-think how we can think of the kitchen as turtle graphics, and we can think of the turtle as the utensils in the kitchen. So here was a connection between what this tutor had said about Piaget's thinking, but wasn't coming through in his writing, and yet was connected for me much later when I was eventually introduced to constructionism. Pratt talks, of course, about constructionism being, in effect, constructivism plus affect. Here's a quote just to justify that claim. He says about Piaget, his discussion does not do full justice to his own idea. He talks almost entirely about cognitive aspects of assimilation, but there's also an affective component. He writes that in the foreword to Mind Studies. So it seems as if Papert was, in effect, trying to realise the Piaget that he knew, because he was a researcher for Piaget, and that my tutor knew as a student of Piaget. And somehow, coming out in Papert's work is this other way of knowing Piaget. He wanted, of course, to try and establish the idea that children could build their own projects using mathematically oriented tools and share these products in a public way. But we ask, whereas constructivism offers a theoretical affect onto constructivism, but whereas we have this very strong foundation at a theoretical level that Piaget has given us, we don't have that same established theoretical explanation for the affect part of the structure. It was something that I couldn't really get to grips with. So constructivism doesn't speak to Papert's vision of harnessing deep engagement. But there's a second issue which I think is problematic in terms of us having constructivism as a sort of orienting framework for constructionism. This is a philosophical dilemma that's lasted now for many, many decades, and it's sometimes referred to as the mind-world split. In a nutshell, the mind that thinks is separate from the body that produces the representations. And from Descartes, we can move on to Locke and Hume, who argued in effect that knowledge comes from experience. And further on to Kant, the world of appearances is constructed by the mind from sensory matter, and that led in effect to, I would say, Piaget's constructivism. So gradually, through these sort of philosophical writings, the mind and the world became separated. Now the problem is that the temptation once you separate the mind and the world is that you can begin to see construction as a set of representations. And we suffer from that, don't we, in our curricula. The curricula are written as a set of representations. But those of us who are involved in constructionism don't put the prime importance on representations. So we don't really want this separation between the mind and the world that's inherent in constructionism. So we ask, is there an alternative that might give significance to affect and also avoid the mind-world split? Well, in the last couple of decades, there have been some developments in constructionism which have attempted to address the affect issue and the mind-world split issue. First of all, I want to say a few words about Richard Noss and Celia Halsey's work on webbing. So, in 1996, they wrote about webbing as the construction of a web of connections between classes of problems, mathematical objects, and relationships, real entities, and personal experiences. And as part of that, we also talked about situated abstractions, that learners abstract by drawing context in rather than removing context. Webbing and situated abstractions can be seen as a response, originally I think, when they wrote about this, to the situated cognition movement, this sense in which knowledge is trapped within a situation. And so they were looking for a way out of that particular cul-de-sac. Well, this can be seen as a sort of valiant attempt, but actually the way that accounts, including my own accounts in those sorts of times, about situated abstractions, still actually tend to regard situated abstractions as internal resources and other stuff as external resources, and so we don't actually, I would argue, escape the mind-world split. And what about affect? Well, myself with Janet Ainley have written quite a bit about these constructs. We define purpose as a purposeful task, as one that has a meaningful outcome or solution. And we talk about utility as the sense of power for a mathematical idea that a child might appreciate when they see how mathematical concepts or methods enable them to make progress with that task. From the design perspective, the key is to invent purposeful tasks that lead to a child's sense of power in mathematics. Most children, of course, love drawing, they love animation, so they readily engage with logo and internal graphics. And this is one of the magnificent inventions from the MIT team led by Pratt. When Turtle Graphics offers this to children, mathematical ideas, or the nuggets of knowledge, as Pratt sometimes calls them, that are buried within the microcode. So things like forward and left and right, you can't avoid these mathematical ideas, and through using them, you gain some sense of their power. Contemporary philosophy, however, is offering some new ideas which seem to us to speak to the aims of constructionism, both in terms of the affect and the mind-world split. So I want to talk about the space of reasons. By arguing that perception is already conceptual, it's able to yield judgment and provide a basis for belief. Here's a quote. In characterising an episode or state as that of knowing, we are not giving an empirical description of that, but Dowell includes any phenomenon. So it includes behaviour, beliefs, desires, which can be made intelligible as manifestations of a responsiveness to reasons. Behaviour becomes intelligible when sound that they're thirsty, looking for a drink. So we can begin to see what their reasons for that action are, even though those reasons haven't been spoken. Another philosopher operating in this area, slightly different perspectives, but close enough for our purposes, thinking about the previous talk. Brandon emphasises what he calls the giving and asking for reasons. And this is something I'm finding really quite helpful. But for him, which is not so helpful, is that the reasons are dependent on social articulation. So for him, the things have to be spoken, articulated in some sort of way. He rejects the priority given to representations and argues that knowing is primitively constituted in the game of giving and asking for reasons. Okay, I missed that. So what I'm wanting to offer is an alternative account. Consider the learning of mathematics as an initiation into the space of reasons, with a focus on thoughts, feelings, and by reason, we don't just mean the power to make judgments logically, but also as a cause, an explanation, or a justification. It's this liberal interpretation of the space of reasons that leads us to believe, Kate and myself, that this account might provide an oriented framework for constructionism that speaks coherently to the mind-world split and to affect. Well, it's perhaps helpful to consider what resituating constructionism in the space of reason might be like. Let's have a sort of example. So Turtle Graphics offers up a reason for engagement, the desire to draw or animate. We can think of this as the machine, in a sense, asking for a reason. And then the child, and perhaps a second child might be working with them, offers instructions with intent, which sometimes might create error messages or unexpected feedback. So the child is giving a reason by responding to the machine, and the machine then is asking for another reason by giving an error message or some sort of feedback. The child responds again by trying to make sense of this feedback. So the child is again giving a reason. So the reasons are sometimes emotional, So the first bullet point there is giving an example of an emotional reason. The sense of power that the child feels is emotional, but is it not also a fundamentally mathematical understanding? Isn't this the same as the amalgamation that Papa makes between affect and other forms of knowledge when he talks about his love of gears? When he talks about his love of gears, there's this sense of the love of gears being a mixture of things, which is including these different aspects that I'm talking about. So it's through this game of asking for and giving reasons that the child gains control over the instructions and learns about the power. Innovation. Should we be concerned about the lack of a theoretical underpinning of constructionism? Is all of this important? Well, as an academic researcher, I would say it is very important to me. And so when Potgieter and Cobb talk about managing the gap, they point out that there's a distance between oriented frameworks, such as constructivism, and frameworks for action, which is how they describe constructionism. And they argue that a detailed design-based research is needed to manage that gap. So consider this analogy. So these are early flying machines. So in the early days of flying, the theoretical development of aeronautics was still at an early stage. Flying machines were built. For a long time, they just didn't fly in a sustained way. The gap between what De Sessa would call an ontological innovation in aeronautics, such as drag and lift and these sorts of ideas, closed that gap. And we're in a similar position, it seems to me. We've got too big a gap between the theoretical underpinning that is constructivism and the practice that we're talking about as constructionism. So what might a better theory, such as one based on the space of reasons, provide? Well, we think that the gap between constructionist practice and oriented theory would be reduced. Constructionist practice might improve by being better targeted on what is really important. Recognising that creating and sharing personal products might be an instance of something bigger and could lead to new opportunities. And finally, we might be better able to communicate why constructionism is effective. So I'm really claiming that some of these issues are around for us, and one of the explanations could be that we're not managing the gap very well, and that gap is rather created by our reliance on constructionism, which doesn't explain the affect aspect of constructionism.
Good timing. Right, thank you very much. That's very interesting because I think there's a lot there to digest for everyone. Anybody have questions? Yes, Barry.
Critiquing Piaget by suggesting that affect was an element that wasn't being considered. My understanding of affect would embrace a lot of things that are much more close to the ground than your purposes, for example. How do you think affect intended the word to be used?
I think when he's referring to the project work that they're doing, when he talks about his love of gears, he's telling us that story because he wants children to love the turtle or whatever tools we provide in a similar way. So he's including deep personal relationship with the mathematics as part of what's important for him in constructionism.
I see. So that's quite independent. In computing these days, we talk about affective computing with the A. Mm-hmm. Only thinking about things that engage with the senses, engage with experience, try to deal with a realm that is not abstract, it's much more concrete. Does that...
It's related, isn't it? But I don't think it's the same.
It's not certainly not what I think had in mind, do you think?
I don't think so.
No, that's clear. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? No, I'm sure there'll be some other thoughts going around in people's heads, because as I said, there's quite a lot to think about. Just whilst Gerald's setting up, I'm sure many of you already know Joe from Constructionism conference in Vienna, the last construction.